amazing Revolutionary War sites from around the city as it stands today, and one in the suburbs because I felt like it. But a little bit of housekeeping while we're here. First off, we are currently also streaming on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. So if you're viewing from there, hello, welcome, shalom, happy to have you. Hi, Carrie from Virginia, lovely to have you. I want to give, oh, hi, Tim as well. So I want to give a quick orientation to where we are right now. On your screen, you should be able to see me waving at you from a tiny box in front of a slide that says Revolutionary New York, Sara Lyons, with some men with guns. To the right of that, you'll see a chat box. Hi, Kathy, you have found the chat box. Please feel free to type anything you like within reason, don't be rude, in the public chat box. Also, if anyone has any questions about anything throughout the tour, I might be able to answer some while we're going through the process, but next to the chat option, you'll see a little thing that says Q&A. Click on that, you'll be able to post a question there, and if I don't get to it during the tour, I will close with a Q&A section afterwards. I am happy to hear everybody's questions. Also, if at any point I freeze up and you know it's not your Wi-Fi, please let me know. Wi-Fi is a tricky, magical thing to me, and we weren't able to get a new router in time. So anything could happen, but that's the magic of live entertainment, right? Also, if you haven't already, please feel free to say hello in the chat box. Let everybody know where you're from, what you're excited about, and just have a blast. Get to know each other. Also, at the top of the chat box, you might notice a bluish-greenish sticky note. If you open that up, it might already be open for you. It'll let you know exactly what I just said. Plus, a couple of you had asked about the option of a tip jar, since this is a free webinar. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Kathy, etc. If this is, once again, completely free, but if you feel so compelled, there is a link there that you can follow. Just throw my name in where it says guide name, and my company will be sure to ferry that along to me at their earliest convenience, and it'll help me buy groceries, so thank you. Now that we've gotten through all the tech specs, let's get to a little bit about what this is going to be about. So I originally designed this tour to be a 2-day, 12-hour total examination of all 5 boroughs of New York for academics and obsessives. Clearly, that's not happening right now. But in an hour, we're still going to be able to cover all those sites because you don't have to take the subway to get to them. It's very exciting. So we're going to cover all 5 boroughs plus a suburban site because I feel like it. And it's going to be a little bit of history, a little bit of what you can see there now, or when things reopen, what they've done with the place. And for a couple of places, I'm going to mention how you can engage with them right now from home. I'm also going to be emailing all attendees with a whole bunch of links to social media accounts and fundraising accounts and ways that you can engage with these sites digitally so that you can hopefully help plan your visit, hopefully with me, to go and visit these sites as soon as it's safe to do so. But now that you have the lay of the land, I want to talk to you a little bit about, first off, these are your sites. And if you have any trouble viewing anything on the screen, my face should be in a box, typically in the top right corner. But if you scroll over me with your mouse, you'll notice arrows on the sides of the box. You can move me around at any time and it won't affect anybody else. You can do so at your leisure to see the rest of the slide pretty clearly. I have moved me, for example, into the bottom right corner. This is a map of all the sites we're going to visit. We're going to go vaguely north to south. It's going to be a whirlwind trip, guys. I hope you're prepared. Buckle up. But before we get to the sites themselves, we got to talk a little bit about New York during the Revolution. Now, if you're like me, you probably didn't learn too much about New York during the Revolution, even and especially if you are from New York. I spent maybe 5 minutes on the Battle of Long Island in high school, total, with my teacher. That's it. Because most of the activity, we tend to think of the Southeast, we tend to think of the Boston Tea Party, we think of Philadelphia, we think of those kinds of sites. But New York was incredibly important during the Revolution. The New York, Long Island area was a critical place to hold for both armies and navies, which is why it was the site of the largest invasion during the war. Those of you who are Hamilton fans remember that 32,000 troops showed up in New York Harbor for the invasion of Manhattan, followed by another 13,000 to occupy the place, while the rest of those soldiers were out fighting on the continent. It was a massive invasion, and it went catastrophically for the Continental Army, in part because of the brothers Howe. Now, General Howe's picture is right next to this timeline here. His brother, Richard Howe, the Earl of Howe, was the chief admiral of the British Navy holding New York Harbor. And they decided to bring the bulk of their soldiers and sailors there because it was central to the colonies. It was a really easy way to break up North and South so that nobody in Vermont could talk to people in South Carolina easily, because it takes way less time to travel by water between those places than by land. And that would have been necessary for effective communication and espionage. So you're breaking up the colonies, making sure that they can't talk to each other. And you're also holding one of the most important shipping ports in the mercantile system triangle. That was the whole reason that the British had colonies in the New World in the first place. So if you controlled New York, you also partially controlled the slave trade and other necessary imports of things that we just didn't have access to in New York and New England at the time. So very critical place to hold, and that's why they held on to it for 7 years before we finally kicked them out in November of 1783, which you can see at the bottom of that timeline. So that's why New York was so important. But losing New York is also why we don't talk about it in our history classes. It's really embarrassing. I'm going to fix that for you right now. Starting up north in the Bronx at Van Cortlandt Park. Now, technically, the Bronx was not part of New York City at the time. New York City basically stopped right above City Hall back in the day. But since this is part of New York today, and since it's part of the New York and New Jersey campaign of the war, I'm including it anyway, because I can, because it's my tour. But Van Cortlandt Park, beautiful park. If you've never been, next time you're on the subway, take the 1 train all the way north to 242nd Street and you're basically there. Or you can drive taking Route 9 or Broadway, and the house is actually in the southwest corner of the park. It's a fairly large park. And the Van Cortlandt Estate was established there by Frederick Van Cortlandt. He built the house, but he actually died before it was finished in 1749. So it was left to his son, James Van Cortlandt. And the people who write about this place say that it's some of the finest Georgian architecture that you can see in all 5 boroughs. It's certainly the oldest standing house still in the Bronx today, and it is kind of cute. But I want to point out, a lot of these stories today are going to be about white people, because a lot of the Black people who were involved in the Revolution were either enslaved and operating at the behest of white people, and therefore we don't really have much recording about them, though we will be able to address that at numerous points along the tour. Or they were running away to the front lines of the war, which were not, for the most part, in New York. And freed Black people and enslaved Black people who were escaping slavery to join the British cause, because the British Army had offered them their freedom if they fought on the front lines of the war. They were not acting in New York. And if anybody knows of any resources on how to learn about the rest of the colonies and African-American experiences there, please let me know. I would love to share that with you as well. But this was built by enslaved people. This was, a major port for slavery importation. And it served during the Revolutionary War as the headquarters temporarily for Rochambeau, Lafayette, and Washington. In fact, it served for all of those people for like a month before the Van Cortlandt Estate was eventually taken over by the British. They were all right on top of each other. And I don't have those pictures here, but the rooms are really cute. They're hard to find, those pictures. They're not as tech savvy and as internet savvy as some of the other houses we're going to see today. But in 1778, on another part of the Van Cortlandt Park that actually used to be part of a different estate, there were 18 Mohican scouts and spies that were killed in a skirmish with Hessian and British soldiers while they were trying to get into occupied Manhattan to ferry information back to the Continental Army to possibly retake Manhattan and kick the British out of that port city. And there's actually a memorial on the property dedicated to those soldiers that lost their lives, the Mohicans that fought for their colonial Continental Army allies. It's the only battle that was fought entirely on the property that's now the Van Cortlandt Park area, although there are some that also dipped into that area as well. It's cute. It's part of the National Historic Landmark Registry. It's operated as a historic house, so you can still visit when they reopen after the pandemic. I highly recommend it. It's really cute. But moving down from the Bronx and into the Fort Tryon and Fort Washington areas. I know that I have a couple friends who live in that area or lived in that area that are on today. Heyo. So the area that we're talking about right now is all the way north, almost in Inwood in Manhattan. Not technically part of New York City back in the day. This would have been the way boonies. This was like all the way out in farm territory, and it was covered in forts back in the day. But the battle I want to center on is the Battle of Fort Washington, which took place over what we now call Fort Washington and Fort Tryon Park. In the top left, you'll see a beautiful painting taken from New Jersey of the Fort Tryon, Fort Washington area. Below that, you'll see a map of troop movements from the battle I'm about to tell you about. Please forgive whoever made this map. It was not me, and they know not what they've done, calling this a United States versus Great Britain battle. Neither of those terms are applicable to this time period. But the visual does give you a good sense of what happened here, which was not good for us. See, Fort Washington was actually one of the last forts in what we now consider New York to be held by the Americans. And on November 16th, 1776, Hessian and British forces came in at all angles against Fort Washington and Colonel Robert McGaw, who was holding the place at the time. McGaw was told to evacuate. At this point, the Continentals had lost almost all of Manhattan Island, and Washington was understandably concerned about the safety of the remaining soldiers there, especially considering that we could now get soldiers from Queens, from Lower Manhattan, and from White Plains and Westchester, because the Battle of White Plains had happened right before this. And McGaw was like, nah, buddy, we got this. We're fine. We'll be all right. And he delayed the evacuation of his troops to New Jersey at Fort Lee across the water. Big mistake, because Washington was supposed to come and assess that to see if he had to, whip that guy into shape. And the British got there first. November 16th, 1776, they came in at all angles and forced stragglers from the battle to evacuate across to Fort Lee and then run away from even more soldiers on that side of the river. In all, 59 soldiers were killed and nearly 3,000 were taken captive, most of which were to be held on prison ships and in sugar factories that had been converted into prisons. We're going to talk a little bit about those facilities later, but for now, suffice it to say, they were gross. They were awful. So this was a catastrophic loss for the Americans, because this was the moment where they lost Manhattan. They lost control of the central shipping port and holding area of the war, and would not get it back for another 7 years. A little bit later, we decided to finally take it back in 1783, and today the parks are absolutely beautiful. You would never be able to tell how many people died there. It's so cute. They've got these stone stairs everywhere. They even have a rescued medieval cloister there, if you're familiar with the Cloister Museum. And if you're not, you should be. It houses a lot of really beautiful medieval artifacts from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Yes, Tim, I see you. I also love that museum. Personal context. Every once in a while, Tim and I like to go there and read the Latin so that we can feel like we didn't waste our high school years. But it's a beautiful place to visit, great place to walk around. The Little Red Lighthouse isn't very far away, and you get a great view of where Fort Lee used to be, which is still parkland on the other side of the river in New Jersey. Absolutely gorgeous. Highly recommend a visit. Let me know when you're going, and I'll come hiking with you. But next up, I want to talk about the oldest farmhouse in New York. It's in the general area. It's at 204th Street on Broadway. This is the Dyckman Farmhouse. It's a little bit newer than the time period that we're talking about. The British evacuated in 1783. This was actually built in 1784, so technically not revolutionary structure, but it's built on top of a Hessian encampment that used to be there, and it replaces a house that used to be at 210th. That was burned down by the Hessians when they made their way north up Manhattan. So it still counts, if you ask me. The Dyckmans came here way back in the day when we were Dutch. They had massive holdings in the area that they had to abandon when they fled north into the mainland. And when they rebuilt this house, they built it right on top of a Hessian encampment. And we know this. Feel free to move me as necessary to see these pictures, because in the bottom right, you're going to see all of the artifacts that were recovered from an excavation on the site during a recent restoration. They rebuilt a Hessian fortification hut in the backyard next to the herb garden, and they found bullets and pewter dishware and also a lot of beer bottles, like so many beer bottles. Partially because we treated our water terribly, in that we did not treat our water. It wouldn't be until the 1850s and 60s when New York got running water, way behind a lot of the larger cities of Europe. We were not good at this at all. But it's a beautiful historic house. It was restored by the Dyckman family in the 19-teens and then given to the city of New York to maintain. There's a trust that also gets involved with this, the Historic House Trust of New York City. And because of this, it's actually a donation-based museum. You do not have to pay an admission fee. But if you do want to support the place when you go visit, they have a little plastic jar that they hang in the front foyer that you can throw a dollar bill into. And I highly do recommend a visit. If you look here, this is a screenshot of their Instagram page so you can see what you're in for. Right in the center is that Hessian hut that I was talking about. Their Instagram, by the way, is amazing, and part of that email later is going to be their Instagram information. Right, Kathy? Absolutely gorgeous rose bushes. They take such good care of this place, and I gotta give major props to their social media manager. They know what they're doing. They're doing a very good job. So see, you don't have to be in New York to engage with these places, though I do recommend you visit as soon as we're able, and I would love to take you around. Now, a little bit south of that is a place that my mother has actually visited that I have been dying to go see in person, the Morris Jumel Mansion. It's at 65 Jumel Terrace in Washington Heights, just a little bit north of where my apartment is. It was built in 1765, and it became a museum at the turn of the 20th century in 1904. Now, it's the oldest house in Manhattan. It's a little bit older than the Dyckman Farmhouse, and it's originally built for Robert Morris and his wife, Mary. Now, Robert Morris was a British officer. So you can understand why he would be a little worried in 1775 when we start fomenting revolution, right? So in 1775, he skips town, heads back to England. His American-born wife goes up to her family in Yonkers. So they're not here when the Continental Army moves into New York to hold it. They're hoping for the duration of the war. And we know that didn't work out. But the Morrises didn't know that until 1777, when after the recapture by the British of Manhattan, Robert came back and brought his wife back, and they, tried to move into their house again. But before that, this served as the headquarters for George Washington after the evacuation of Brooklyn, after the Battle of Brooklyn, for about a month, from mid-September to mid-October 1776. After that, it was held as the headquarters for Sir Henry Clinton, who was a lieutenant general for the British. And then it was given to a Hessian baron to use as his headquarters when Clinton had better things to do. Now, during this time, the Morrises would have lived in the house with the commanding officers, as was customary for these kinds of things. Every single former colony in New York has at least 5 headquarters of George Washington, because he moved with his troops and he'd just, take over a couple of rooms of somebody's stately mansion. So this wasn't just a military operation, it was also a home around that time. Now, in 1783, the Morrises move out officially. All of them head to England during the evacuation of New York, and their property was requisitioned by the brand new United Confederation of States. This is before we officially became the United States of America under the American Constitution. We'll get to that later. It's a whole thing. But the thing about this is that technically, our government should have paid the Morrises for all of the property that they confiscated, and they didn't, in a blatant violation of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. But we would sort all of that out later during the War of 1812. This would not be the last time that we addressed proper compensation for confiscated goods and real estate from during the war. Nowadays, beautiful historic house. We'll get back to those people in a second. A lot of these rooms are restored back to the way they would have looked during the Revolution. But a lot of them are also restored back to how they would have looked in the early to mid 1800s. Forgive me for straying from the timeline here. I want to tell you about these folks because they're a hoot. The gentleman on the left is Stephen Jumel, who was a French immigrant merchant who came in and bought up the property from the government in 1810, along with his wife, Eliza, who's in the center here. Now, we don't really know much about the rest of Stephen's time because there wasn't much of it. Some people say he died of a heart attack. Others say that he fell very conveniently onto a pitchfork. And people who are a little bit less subtle about it say that Eliza unwrapped his wound dressing and watched him bleed out. Now that's really grim. But a couple years later, she married an eligible old bachelor in the front parlor. He is all the way on the right. That is Aaron Burr, friends. Revolutionary War hero, depending on how you want to frame it, political assassin, wild character, major landowner in New York. He actually owned a big chunk of Soho at the time, before it was Soho. So she married him, and the marriage lasted 3 years, almost to the day. And on the day that Aaron Burr filed for divorce, he died. Yeah, we are probably looking at a Black Widow situation. But because the divorce wasn't finalized, she still inherited so much of his property. So she is either the old Carol Baskin, or she has very convenient timing. But either way, she was made a very wealthy woman from the deaths of both of her husbands. And it's said that all three of the people pictured here still haunt the house to this day. Ooh, very exciting stuff. So if you are a ghost hunter, if you like historic homes, if you want to explore occupied New York, highly recommend a visit to the Morris Jumel Mansion. But there are two more sites that I want to briefly glance on from this period in the Uptown Manhattan area. This is Hamilton Grange. Also, technically not in our timeline. It was built in 1802. But because it was the home that Alexander Hamilton created for his family, it's a lot of fun. It's run as a national park. It's up on 141st Street and Convent Avenue, all the way up in Hamilton Heights. It's actually not the original location. And as a result, there are some things in the restored rooms that are aging differently because they're getting a different kind of sunlight. So whether you're a history nerd or a museum curation nerd, like, definitely go visit. Just don't read any of the displays. It's not the park ranger's fault. They were written 30 years ago. They're not very good and they can't afford to fix them. So I'm going to make my only political plea of the whole tour. When you're voting, think of the Parks Department. Think of how much good they can do redoing those displays and making them better if we voted in senators that will give them more money. End of political rant. And a little bit south of that, at 114th Street, we also have this gorgeous memorial of Lafayette handing a flag to General Washington. We don't think there was actually anything particularly momentous that happened on this spot. It was just a nice place to put a statue. And the locals really like it. It's cute. If you really like climbing cliffs in New York City parks, go to Morningside Heights, go visit it, check out the statue. You might be really sweaty when you find it, but it's worth it. Now that we have seen Uptown and the Bronx, it's time to go downtown. Now, this is New York City proper, from when the revolution happened. This is where the entire city was. And we are starting at the northernmost border of it at City Hall. Now, we did not have a City Hall there back in the day. That didn't exist. City Hall was actually where Federal Hall is now. And we'll get to more about that later, I promise. But where City Hall currently is today, supposedly there used to be a tavern on the northern edge of the city, right next to the city walls. And there's a statue on the lawn looking up at the rest of Manhattan and at City Hall of a young man named Nathan Hale. And you might know his name from his most famous quote, "I only regret that I have one life to give for my country," which makes him sound really austere and like special and wonderful. But I gotta break it to you guys, he was not bright. He had a lot of energy and he had not a lot of brains. The poor dear. I want to tell you a little bit about how this went down. He was the first spy conclusively to die in the revolution, and he was not a very good one. See, when the British came into New York, they started with Brooklyn. It was the first thing they got to. It was really easy to take because it was mostly farmland, and that meant they had a staging area to move into Staten Island and Manhattan. They kind of came at all angles from Manhattan. So in Brooklyn, we suddenly have a whole bunch of occupying forces. And Washington wanted to know where they were planning on going next to plan appropriately. And the only person who volunteered for the job was 21-year-old Nathan Hale. Sweet, sweet boy. He shows up being ferried across to Flushing, across the East River from Manhattan, on September 12th. September 15th, 1776, we lose the island of Manhattan. So he was not able to get a lot done in that time. But in that time, he was also caught. Now, he was supposed to be undercover, as a spy. But his cover was not very good because one of the Loyalist officers in Brooklyn recognized him. Even if he hadn't, Nathan Hale kept his Yale diploma in his boot with his name on it. He was not good at this. And he was also, very hopeful. He was a hopeful boy. So when this British officer came up to him and said, hey, so I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm with you. I hope General Washington is doing well. Nathan immediately said, oh my God, thank God. I thought I was all alone here. Yes, I'm actually spying on you guys. At which point he was clapped in irons. It was the easiest thing for them to do. And he was brought to Manhattan, and he was brought up apparently to 66th Street, or where 66th Street is today, to be interrogated by General Howe. And it's for that reason that we don't actually think that this is where he was hanged for treason in a city hall. There's 3 other locations that claim that's where he could be, at 66th and 3rd, and then 2 places pretty close to Grand Central. In fact, the Daughters of the American Revolution chapter for Manhattan based their choice of office on where they thought Nathan Hale was hanged. And we have no idea for sure because no one's ever found his body. It was buried unmarked. We have no idea where it is. But because the statue is in front of in front of a city hall, rather, let's go with that for now. It's poetic. He looks really fun. You cannot actually go inside of City Hall except for on open house days, and then the rooms are limited. But City Hall Park is really beautiful. As you can see in this picture of the statue, it gets nice and green and leafy. It's a cute place to hang out. And then not far from that, you have 2 important churches. And I'm going to talk about the southernmost one first. This is Trinity Church. A couple of you have actually visited Trinity Church with me. It's currently paused in the middle of massive renovations. So you can't go inside there now, and you probably won't be able to for a little while after the lockdown on churches is lifted. But on the left, that is what it looks like today. That is not what it looked like at the beginning of the American Revolution. That is pictured on the right in this sketch. See, the original church was burned down in the Great Fire of 1776. The parishioners here blamed the Patriots. There was some discussion amongst the upper brass in the Continental Army to leave a scorched earth behind when they fled Manhattan so that the British wouldn't be able to easily use it. George Washington shot that down. So if it was Patriots that set the place on fire, it was not under orders. The Patriots blamed the Hessians for getting so excited about taking the place and getting really drunk and somebody dropping a torch or something. No matter who did it, it was really quite tragic. We lost this church along with a couple businesses and somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 homes. It was devastating. We lost 1/3 of New York that day. So the original church is no longer there. But the original church and the church that was rebuilt there afterwards both served as important places to disseminate information for Loyalists. New York being a big port, as it was, and having an extensive trade network that was dependent on being connected with Britain, a lot of the richer people in New York were Loyalists. They did not want a war. They did not want to lose their trade connections. They were really, really worried. Amongst those who were worried was a priest, an Anglican priest by the name of Charles Inglis, who actually wrote pamphlets denouncing the revolution, including, and I'm going to read this title for you, "The True Interest of America Impartially Stated in Certain Strictures on a Pamphlet Entitled Common Sense." Nobody ever told him that brevity was the soul of wit. But that pamphlet is widely regarded today by scholars as being the most eloquent and persuasive Loyalist propaganda and publication from the entire war. It was so persuasive that the printing house that it was originally being printed down in was burned down by Patriots while it was being printed. This was when there were still a fair amount of Patriots on the island. This was, right before the Battle of Brooklyn. And he got it reprinted somewhere else. And that's how it still exists today. He continued to give services there during the early fomentation period and during the occupation. He was one of the major supporters of the British cause of quelling the war quickly. In fact, he refused the order from General Washington and the Continental Congress to stop praying for the king and his family in front of 150 armed soldiers, and also in front of George Washington, who went there to pray. Not at the same time. George would not have allowed guns into a church. It's just not the kind of guy he was. But yeah, no, he had a lot of chutzpah, although he would probably resent me calling it that. He ended up fleeing to Britain at the end of the war as well. But some of his parishioners ended up rebuilding a nation after this was all over. I have these pictures here. Let's, oh no! Okay, never mind. Small technical glitch, we're all good. So I have these pictures here of these three gentlemen all the way on the left. That is Inglis himself. The man in the center is John Jay. You might know him from the college. And next to him is a lovely gentleman by the name of James Duane. Now, James and John Jay were both against the war initially. They did not want to have fighting. They wanted to settle this peacefully. But when they realized that wasn't possible, they became signers on the Declaration of Independence, and eventually they were in the team that helped to devise the early stages of the Articles of Confederation. They built our country. And somehow they managed to peacefully coexist with a loyalist parish leadership in the area. And when this was all over, they reformed the place as an Episcopal church and modeled it as the all-American house of worship. Really cool dudes. Speaking of cool dudes, there are so many cool people buried in this cemetery, guys. So even if the church isn't renovated in time for the reopening, I highly recommend a visit to the graveyard. A couple of you have already been there with me. There are such greats as Angelica Schuyler, Elizabeth Hamilton, and also Alexander Hamilton, seen in the bottom left with a lovely family, before they restored the grave most recently. That is not a chip, by the way. In the top of the rectangular piece, that is their stuffed animal elephant. They take it everywhere they go, and it's adorable. So I had to use the picture. But some of the most important movers and shakers of the entire revolution are buried in here. So definitely should be on every grave watcher's list. They also have a pretty intense community outreach program there. They don't take very good care of the graves because they're too busy taking care of the living. So it really does have an old graveyard kind of feel to it. Highly recommend. Now, this parish has a sister church in it, St. Paul's Chapel. Now, you probably know St. Paul's as the survivor church, the only church that made it through 9/11 without being damaged and destroyed. But it also survived the Great Fire of 1776. So we still have the furniture and the artifacts from when George Washington used to pray here. So if you do come visit, you'll see the little display for 9/11. You'll also see George Washington's pew and a whole dedication to Reverend Inglis, somehow sitting very comfortably next to each other. And a couple of other artifacts from the war as well that I'll get to later. It said that the steeples of these two churches were the first things that you would see when you were sailing into New York. Clearly, you can see from behind this with One World Trade Center in the background, this is no longer the case. But it's a nice, sentimental, sweet thing to talk about. And yes, the metallic paint on the steeple is original. That's actually what they put there. So like, good for them, making them super shiny. Maybe it was an inspiration for our glass and metal skyscrapers. Who knows? But next, if that's where they prayed, I want to talk to you a little bit about the place where America was born, Federal Hall. It's so cool. Now, this is not the original Federal Hall building. It's not. That was actually torn down for scrap. $400 we got for that pile of rubble, and Philadelphia makes fun of us to this day, and I don't blame them. But the original building was built as a city hall on top of the old fort walls of Fort Amsterdam, the Dutch fortification. The British built their city hall on top of the place, basically to have one over on the Dutch. And it served as a courthouse for some time. This is where John Peter Zenger was put on trial for publishing things that the king didn't like. He eventually was cleared of all charges because the courts decided that he could not be prosecuted for telling the truth. That eventually got enshrined in the same building when it became our first Capitol building under the Constitution as freedom of speech. But in the Revolution, this served not only as a base of municipal conduct for the British government, but also this is where the Declaration of Independence was read out to the people of New York before they went down and tore down a statue of King George that we're going to talk about later. So there's a lot of Revolutionary War and early federal history that happened on this very block, including the inauguration of President George Washington, seen pictured here in the statue, holding his hand out. He's lifting it off the George Washington Bible to signal that his presidency has begun. The Bible, by the way, inside the current Federal Hall building. So when it's reopened, I highly recommend a visit. Go see a piece of history. It's really, really incredible. Now, not far from that, I told you about this statue. There's a beautiful little park called Bowling Green. It's a little oval at the bottom of Broadway, and there's a gorgeous fountain in it. You can see it in 2 different seasons here. But that fountain used to be a statue. And the statue, this 4,000 gilded lead statue of King George III was installed in 1770 to quell any dissent amongst the people, thinking, oh yeah, if we show them our majestic king, they'll feel his presence and feel some sense of belonging in the empire. Nope. 3 years later, New York City passed its first ever anti-graffiti law specifically about this statue because people kept on wrecking it. New Yorkers have always had an attitude, and I love it. In fact, after we read out the Declaration of Independence, July 9th, 1776, the whole band of soldiers and all of the local women ran down to the old Bowling Green, the oldest park in New York, and they got their ropes and they tore down the statue and smashed it to bits. They even wrecked the fence nearby. Most of the fence was put back up, but the finials were all chopped off. One of those finials is currently in St. Paul's Chapel, not far from Washington's pew. But the story goes that most of the statue was broken down into bits, sent off to Connecticut and turned into bullets. There are 8 pieces remaining in the New York Historical Society Museum all the way up on the Upper West Side. There's a piece in Connecticut. There's a piece in England. So not all of it was melted down, but I like the idea of a German descended, because his grandpa was originally from Germany when he inherited the British throne, a German-descended British king being fired back at German and British soldiers. I think it's just so poetic. I delight in this. Now, later on, this park would also serve as the final goodbye point to all of the British soldiers that were being marched out of New York in 1783. Washington marched all the way down from Van Cortlandt Park all the way to the harbor to get the redcoats out of here. So the true fomentation of revolution here in New York starts and ends in Bowling Green. Now, right across the street is 1 Broadway. Today it's a Citibank, as you see on the left, but back in the day, it used to be the Kennedy Estate. And the Kennedys, not the same Kennedys, were not home when the Continental Army moved into Manhattan. They would, of course, soon move out of Manhattan. But there was another house that was being prepared for George Washington and his wife, Martha. In the meantime, while that was being prepped, Washington lived and ran his operations out of the Kennedy Estate at 1 Broadway. He would move back out in August to join his wife at the other estate. But there is a nice little plaque on the side of the Citibank that says, George Washington hung out here for a while. And then when the Continentals left Manhattan, left New York City, General Howe, not Admiral Howe, he'd be somewhere else, moved into there and used that as one of his headquarters for quite some time. Yeah, no, Carrie, I agree. He slept absolutely everywhere. He's a very tall man. I wouldn't be surprised if he slept in 3 states at the same time and just spread out. But not far from there is a beautiful little row of restaurants. I haven't heard a lot from any of them. If anyone has, please let me know. I'm hoping that they're doing okay. I'm hoping that they're weathering this storm because, oh boy, Mad Dog and Beans Cantina is the best Mexican food I have ever had in my life. And if we lose this to COVID-19, I'll be so upset. But long before there was Mexican food there, this row here on Stone Street and the street next door, Pearl Street, and all these buildings actually have doors on either side. This was our former printing center. This is where all of those pamphlets that the Loyalists were printing happened. This is where William Bradford, who trained a generation of printers who would print Thomas Paine's work and Benjamin Franklin's words before he decided he was going to do his own thing. All of that happened on this street. Now, after the Revolution, the printers would all move up to what we now call the Civic Center by Pace University, where they still have their School of Journalism. But for some time, this is where all of those pamphlets were printed. So there's a lot of typing history, and I see you, Dad. This is for you. And then at the end of that street is Franz's Tavern. Great place to get a drink if you have a lot of money. Great place to get meatballs if you don't have a lot of money. But this is a beautiful little tavern, and it served 2 very important purposes at the beginning and at the end of the Revolutionary period. At the beginning of the period, this is actually where we had the New York Tea Party. Everyone knows about the Boston Tea Party. New York's was better, and I'll tell you why. So all of the people in New York who were upset about the Tea Act, they just started screaming. They just started screaming about everything in the press, in the streets, the whole thing. So in order to do some damage control, the tea companies brought them a whole bunch of tea for free to say, hey, please don't hate us. You don't have to pay taxes on this because you don't have to pay for this. And they said, thanks. Great. And then immediately dumped that tea into the harbor while they watched, stone-faced. Like, the gall on these people in 1773. That is the level of sass I aspire to. And at the end of the war, this is where George Washington gathered his officers for a drink, December 4th, 1783, to say a final goodbye to them right before the Continental Army was disbanded. You got to remember, at the beginning of America's existence, we did not have a standing army. We wouldn't for some decades, really. So this was the end of the Continental Army's run, and he was saying goodbye to all of his officers. Supposedly, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, and he took every single one of them by the hand and said something special to each of them. Even he apparently got a little weepy, and if you know anything about Washington, you know that's rare. He was not a very emotive person, and he was not comfortable giving public addresses. So this was a huge moment in personal development for him as he was getting ready for a possibility of statescraft, which he never anticipated for himself, but he figured somebody had to do it. Very Constantinian of him. So there we go. And not far from there is One Police Plaza, which you know if you've seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine. What you don't know if you've seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine is that there is a tiny little brick wall off in the corner, so hard to find, but let me know when you try, I'll come help you out, of the Sugar House Prison. This is all that remains of a sugar factory that used to be what is now One Police Plaza's grounds. Now, back in the day, sugar factories and ships were used as prisoner of war camps, basically. And conditions were terrible. All that sugar everywhere meant that you had constant pest problems, even when this wasn't a sugar factory. And that was an issue. So, a small issue though. This particular sugar factory was in operation for the duration of the war. So this probably actually wasn't a prison for the duration of the war, but we know that there were others in New York that we don't know exactly which ones. And this stands as a kind of memorial to everybody who died in prisoner of war camps at the British base of operations in New York. We'll be getting later to the prison ships as well. But the last Manhattan stop I want to tell you about is South Street Seaport. Because this was such an important port town, there was tons of goods being shipped in and out for civilians and also for the army out of the South Street Seaport. And the people who ran the docks were some of the fiercest loyalists in New York, because so much of what they did depended on that mercantile triangle and having a good relationship with their trading partners, which were their, mother country. This district suffered a terrible economic blow at the end of the war, but it recouped pretty well. And by 1787, we were one of the biggest shipping ports in the New World again. So nowadays, there's a bunch of museums. There's a big gay ice cream post there, best soft serve I've had in my life. And they have a whole bunch of old restored ships that you can visit there as well. And if you remember, they used to have a bodies exhibit there that got destroyed in Hurricane Sandy. It's a whole thing. But it's a tourist trap, but it's my favorite tourist trap. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the Battery. See all that green land there? None of that existed during the war. The northernmost border of Battery Park was called the Battery because of the battery of cannons that were there, that only ever fired during the taking of the Fort Amsterdam area by the British, during the Battle of New York to take Manhattan in 1776, and then again when we were taking Manhattan back in 1783. It did not fire any shots during the War of 1812 because the British knew that if lightning struck twice, we'd be ready for it this time. So since they used us as a major base of operations during the Revolution, they really didn't touch New York Harbor during the War of 1812. So we got off real lucky. It's a shame. We were really well prepared, including on Governor's Island, where we built 4 forts for the War of 1812. Some of those forts are actually renovated Revolutionary War forts that were held by the British. Now, all of them are a lovely tourist attraction, open seasonally as a national park. And the pictures on the bottom are actually lovely walking trails that you can visit. And they've got a food area. They've got all sorts of things you can climb on. It's a blast. And that's also smack dab between Manhattan and Queens. And there's a beautiful little Quaker meeting house in Queens, the oldest building in the entire borough of Queens. Now, this would have been its own county back in the day, but they've had some financial struggles recently, so it's not as flashy as a lot of the other restored buildings from the period, but it's cute. It's really cute. And they have records of marriage for Quakers. They have all sorts of records from the spycraft that was happening in the area in Quaker sects. See, the Quakers were pacifists and patently against the war. But once the war happened and they saw how the British were conducting themselves on the island, because, oh boy, the occupation forces were some of the meanest people you've ever met, and they did not treat civilians well. There were a fair number of Quakers that actually operated as nonviolent spy cells for the Continentals to put an end to this whole thing. And so you can visit this restored Quaker house right here in Flushing as well. It's actually like, I want to say maybe 5-10 minutes drive from where I am right now in Forest Hills. And not far from that, technically outside of the city borders, but I'm going to get away with it, is the Sands Willets house. Now, the part of the house that existed during the war is actually the shorter bit. If you look at the picture on the bottom, the west wing of the house, all the way on the left, used to be the home of Colonel John Sands IV. John Sands IV was the son of John Sands III and his wife Elizabeth. John Sands IV inherited the property from his dad, along with his wife Elizabeth, who managed the property for him while he was fighting in the war on the continent, while also raising his sons Robert, John V, and Elizabeth. this is genealogically one of the most confusing families I've ever met in my life. But I want to point this out because Elizabeth was actually a gun runner during the Revolution, and she smuggled gunpowder to the Continental Army in Connecticut one day in 1782 in this like massive run to save the Continental Army in the middle of a storm while being chased by Hessian soldiers. And if you want to know more about that, get in touch with me. I wrote a whole play about it. But there's a ton of amazing historic houses on Long Island of Declaration signers, Constitution signers, movers and shakers in the American Revolution, like this, the William Floyd Estate. Francis Lewis also lived on Long Island. Both of them are pictured below. Come visit my island. It's cute. But we're moving on to Brooklyn, and we're speeding right through. This is the Old Stone House. It is built entirely out of pieces of the Old Stone House, which was destroyed in the Battle of Brooklyn. And yes, Samuel Floyd, I see you. But yeah, so the Battle of Brooklyn was really the beginning of the end of the beginning for the Continental Army. It was when they really started realizing how out of their depths they were, because the British came through in full force to take the island, Brooklyn and the rest of Long Island, to cut the colonies in half. And if you'll notice, there's actually a Maryland flag being flown in this tiny diorama I'm showing you. And that's because there are 400 Maryland soldiers that gave their lives defending the Old Stone House, just a farmhouse that was lying around that they picked as the place of battle, from the British to distract them so that Washington could make it safely over the East River and escape. And their heroic sacrifices marked not only at the Old Stone House, which is now run as a museum, and a great place to take the kids, actually, but also at Greenwood Cemetery, which is coming up in a couple of stops, and also in a couple places in Maryland. That's part of why Maryland and New York have a pretty tight relationship in terms of state to municipality. In between here in Greenwood, though, is Fort Greene, the former location of Fort Greene. This is a schematic that was drawn up by Olmsted and Vaux, who also did Central Park. And Fort Greene is the home to a prison ship memorial. Now, over the course of the war, we lost 6,800 soldiers in action. We lost 12,000, almost twice the amount of soldiers and civilians in prison ships, from diseases, from mistreatment, from wounds. Pictured over here on the right are a couple of sketches of what the SS Jersey would have looked like, one of the most infamous prison ships in the war. And a lot of these were in the East River, holding people from all over the colonies. They'd all get dragged up to New York to the base of operations. Their remains, some of them are interred in Fort Greene Park. The rest of them are interred in Greenwood Cemetery. We're finally at Greenwood. Greenwood isn't just a resting place for a lot of revolutionary heroes who are really rather unsung in their efforts. It's also the home of Battle Hill. This was one of the central locations for the Battle of Brooklyn, and it was a great place to observe the Battle of New York because it's the highest point in Brooklyn. And if you go there to visit today, not only will you find a lot of really cool New Yorkers, you'll get a great view of Manhattan, and you'll get a sense of what the landscape all over Brooklyn and Queens would have looked like during the Revolution in a way that you really can't anywhere else. But we're on to our last borough. We're going to Staten Island, and this is where Admiral Howe, rather than General Howe, ran his operations. You can see a lot of what life would have been like for the locals then at historic Richmond Town, which is kind of north-ish on Staten Island. It was also a large Loyalist stronghold, and the Loyalists got a lot of business out of the British because there were a lot of craftspeople here. Every horseshoe that you saw in Manhattan was made in Staten Island. So this was a really great place for the Navy to hang out, the British Navy, to get outfitted with every possible thing they could ever need. Now, historic Richmond Town is maintained as a historic village, much in the same way as historic Williamsburg and Old Bethpage, but the place itself is restored to the mid-1800s, a little bit different. They prefer not to think of themselves as traitors to the American cause, and who could blame them? But it's cute. Got a couple historic houses lying around. It's a lot of fun to visit. Don't do it in bad weather. They don't open in bad weather. It's all, volunteer basis. But I'll be able to get you all the contact information to find out more about what they do too. They do like county fairs and things like that because they are the biggest fairgrounds in Richmond County. And they're not far from Fort Wadsworth, which was the naval base of operations where everything was run out of for the British Navy. This is not what it would have looked like. It would have been much smaller, much shorter. This is a later fortification from the War of 1812 and the Civil War when we thought maybe we might get some action up here. But it was particularly active around that time, and it was something that we were very eager to take and to do up after the war was over in preparation for continued attacks after the Treaty of Paris. And finally, our last stop on this wild journey at the southern tip of Staten Island. This is the Conference House, also known as Billup's House, named for Christopher Billup. Christopher Billup, the original, sailed around Staten Island in less than 24 hours and nearly killed everybody on his ship. And he did this because those were the rules for how to decide which islands in New York Harbor belonged to New York Colony. So he sailed around Staten Island in less than a day, and as a result, Staten Island is part of New York. And to thank him for this, he was given a little over 900 acres on Staten Island, and he built this beautiful little house for himself. Now, his great-grandson, also named Christopher Billup, hosted a conference here in 1776 between Ben Franklin and a number of other important revolutionaries, and the Admiral Howe, to try to negotiate peace terms so that we didn't have to go to war at all. And after 3 days, Benny was like, nope, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to keep trying to shoot you. And the war went on for 7 more years. But at the end of the war, the Billupses fled. They went on their merry way back to England. And pretty soon after, this was turned into a couple taverns and then into a historic house that you can still visit today. I know it's at the far end of Staten Island and it's hard to get to, but it's really cute and you should go do it. It's also a great place to learn about the Lenape that were living there at the time, because an excavation revealed that this was a major base for summer fishing grounds for the Lenape that lived there before. So it's a really, really, really cool place at the conclusion of a whole bunch of really, 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 really cool places that you can visit and get in touch with revolutionary New York. I hope that this taster plate of revolutionary New York gives you a reason to explore more. When it's safe to come out and visit me, please visit me. I would love to come and take you to some of my favorite spots. There's tons of good food options, by the way, around every single one of the locations I described. And I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough. If you did, I'm going to be sending you an email later today, so please let me know your thoughts. Please let me know if any of these sites are things that you would like to do a deeper dive on, if you have any other ideas for what you'd like to see me present, if you want to learn more about Civil War New York or World War I New York, or anything non-military history related about New York history. Please let me know. I'm also going to send you the contact information for my boss so you can let him know too. And look out for my email, friends. Let me know if you want to see more. And if you do feel like throwing a tip in, if you feel like this was worth your free admission, once again, that link is above. If you have any questions, I'm going to be hanging out for a couple minutes to take those now. If not, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And I look forward to possibly seeing you virtually soon. Thank you all so much. All right. So I am also going to enable attendee mics. So if anyone wants to ask a question over microphone, if you have your microphones enabled, you are more than welcome to do so. Oh, hi, Mom. Thank you to you too. All right. Oh, and while we're still here, Tony Fraggle and Donna Fraggle, thank you so much for enjoying it on Facebook. By the way, if anyone is still on here and wants to rewatch this in the later future, oh my God, like Nathan, hi Nathan. This will be available for an extended period of time on Facebook and on YouTube. I'm gonna send links to that in the email that I'm sending to attendees later. So if you do want to rewatch, if you forgot something that you wanted to look up again, or if you just wanted to hop on the boat a little bit late, I got you. Yes, quick question. I believe you would have to copy that in, but it looks difficult to copy from the sticky. So I am going to retype the tip link here in a place that can be copied and pasted. exp1.com/tips. That is the link that is copy and pastable, should anyone feel the need, but no pressure. I'm just happy to be here, really. But yeah, so this will be viewable later on YouTube and Facebook. You'll have those links. You'll have links to my favorite Instagram accounts from my favorite historic houses. Who knows? I'm due to talk to my mom later. If she has any special insight she wants to share with everybody that she doesn't want to type in the chat about the Morris Jumel mansion when she and my dad visited, I'm sure I will be able to send that along to you as well. Oh, thank you guys. I'm so glad that you guys enjoyed it. Yes, I can't wait to do this live with you in the future as well. Yes, yes, yes. Fabulous. Okay. But if it is time for you guys to tune out and take a screen break, don't let me keep you. If anyone has questions, I'll stick around until about 2:10 and all will be well.
Sarah, I have a question.
Yes, hello. I have an answer. How you doing, Tim?
Hey. The thing you mentioned about the boat race around Staten Island, that seems like a really odd way to decide what gets to be part of New York. Who thought that idea up?
Isn't it, though? It was decided by the colonial governments of both colonies. They were fighting over who got custody of the various islands in New York Harbor, because whoever controlled that harbor controlled all of the northern colonies' most valuable trade. So furs and grain and all that stuff, slaves as well, that was huge. So whoever controlled those islands had some control over trade. But for the little islands, it was obvious. Ellis Island, and also basically at that time, Big Oyster Island or Little Oyster Island, now the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, those are small enough that you can sail around that in an hour without trying. Same goes for Governor's Island, but Staten Island's massive. Staten Island is geographically much larger than Manhattan. So there was the only fair way they could think of to settle this was anything that was big enough to sail around, that you couldn't sail around it in a day or less, went to New Jersey, and all the smaller ones went to New York. That was seen as an equitable way to do things. Leave it to Christopher Billop to try to kill everybody on his ship to get the glory of claiming Staten Island for New York. But he got a nice house out of it.
So he's the person we can blame that Staten Island is now part of the city.
Yes, it is very much culturally New Jersey. And proximity-wise and how much of it is actually on the Jersey side of the river, very, very much. That is, we shouldn't have Staten Island. But he was a madman, and he's why we have Staten Island. It's wild. It's so wild. But yeah, that's how that happened. When they originally thought up that idea, it was not a challenge, but that is the way that Captain Billop took it. Nutty people.
Where it remains to this day.
Yes. Yes, it is. And it's interesting, too, because geographically it should have been part of New Jersey. Culturally, it's much closer associated with New Jersey because there's almost no river between it and New Jersey. And to this day, it tends to align itself closer with New Jersey cultures in terms of that specific brand of Italian Americanness. In terms of political causes, both just general party affiliation and what it is that they care about in politics. The entire history of New York after Billup's madcap sail around the island indicates that really we just should have given it to New Jersey. They'd all be much happier. If you look at a voting map of New York, almost every single time, that's the one borough that doesn't agree with the rest of the boroughs and does agree with Northern and Central Jersey. But it is what it is. So that's what it is. You got a cute house out of it, and we got a cute historic house out of it. So that's nice. Yeah. I hope that answered your question. It might have over-answered your question. I am an over-answerer. All right. But it is 2:11, my friends, and it has been a long time since I have had a glass of water. If anyone thinks of any questions after this, please feel free to reach out. All of you attendees have my email address. And if you're tuning into this after the fact, chances are if you stuck around this long, you've probably had me on a tour before. So you probably have my email address there too. So feel free to reach out to New York Tour 1/Experience First, depending on which brand you know us under. We are now Experience First, but a number of you know us from before. And we'll be more than happy to answer those questions, or God knows, start up a virtual tour about it. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, that you're staying safe, washing your hands, and I look forward to seeing you all virtually soon, and also in person as soon as it is safe to do so. Thank you all so much. All right, and we're ending the webinar. All right, so I think we got 6 seconds.